Teacup poisoner. Of London on the 7th of September 19 in a small suburban village in the West End 47, Graham Young was born to parents Fred and Margaret Young. When Margaret first became pregnant, she became very unwell and was diagnosed with pleurisy and inflammation of the lungs. She was eventually admitted to a maternity hospital which was built on the grounds of an old smallpox hospital in Kingsley. While in hospital, her condition got worse and she was diagnosed with tuberculosis. On the 7th of September 1947, early hours of the morning, she went into labor. At this time her health was very poor indeed due to a very bad birth. When Graham was born he was very cold and he wouldn't cry, but after the nurses sorted him out he was okay. Unfortunately, on the 23rd of December 1947, Margaret died of TB. Fred did his hardest to look after Graham and his 8-year-old daughter Winifred, as well as go to work and keep the housework up to date. Fred just couldn't cope, so he sent Winifred to stay with her grandmother and Graham went to stay with Fred's sister Winnie and her husband Jack, who lived not far away from Fred on North Circular Road. After a while Fred started going with a younger woman than himself. Her name was Molly and she was 28, Fred was 43. On the 1st of April 1950, Fred and Molly got married at the local registry office. He then sold his house and bought his sister's house at 768 North Circular Road. Once Fred and Molly got the house sorted, they went and brought Graham, who was about 2 and Molly 10, home with them, so they were a very nice little family. So they thought, as it was no time for Fred to start school, Fred thought it would be a good idea to enroll Fred at the same school as Winifred, so Fred started school at Bryant-Croft Jr. While at school Fred was a bit of a loner. The other children and even the teachers thought he was a bit weird. In 1958, Fred sat an exam to decide what school he would attend next. Graham got into Kelly Secondary. Fred was so pleased with Graham that he went and brought Graham his first chemistry set. Without his dad knowing, Graham was already mixing chemicals. He would take some of Molly's perfume and mix it with whatever he could find. Sometimes he'd mix something to keep in his pocket, and when no one was looking he would sniff it to get high. He would come home with frogs and the poor things were never seen again. It wasn't long before the family cat got very sick and a lot of cats went missing from the estate he lived on. While Graham was at school, the other pupils would avoid him as he always speak about Hitler and black magic. He claimed once he did a ritual and sacrificed a black cat. He made a swastika badge and wore it at school. Of course he was asked to remove it. Graham refused and got the cane. Although some of the teachers thought he was strange, they also thought he was a good student as he was studying all the time. One day he was in the library and was caught by a teacher reading books about Cripping, who was a serial poisoner, and other books like it. He was told off and sent on his way. He made a friend, another boy who was very interested in science. His name was Christopher Williams. They started doing everything together, included lunch breaks. One day Graham and Williams swapped sandwiches. All of a sudden Williams got sick and needed time off school. When he came back, Graham wanted to know everything Williams went through. Williams taught Graham was being a good friend, but he wasn't. He was the one who poisoned Williams. Because Williams had been so unwell, his parents decided it would be nice to take him to London Zoo along with his friend Graham, who came with a bottle of drink which had a sprinkle of antimony in it. Williams became very unwell again, but that was the last time he poisoned Williams. Graham decided not to poison his friend again. Instead he decided to poison his stepmother Molly. He sprinkled small amounts of antimony on food and drink and sit and watch what happens to her. He really didn't her, so he would increase the amounts of poison. Molly went through stages. She had very bad cramps in the stomach and she was violently vomiting. After a while her hair started falling out. She went to the doctors, but they didn't know what was wrong with her. Fred came home from work where he found his wife laying outside curled up in agony. Fred got a ambulance and she was admitted to hospital, where she went into a coma and died. All the time Graham was watching on. Very soon Fred was experiencing the same symptoms as his wife. He was also taken to hospital again. Graham watched on, documenting everything in his mind. He sat at Fred's bedside all the time in hospital. Eventually the doctors realized Fred had been poisoned. The doctors were having a disagreement. One doctor said it looks like antimony, the other said he thought it was arsenic. Graham stood between them and gave his point of view. With that, Fred shouted to the staff to get his son away from him. Fred had realized in that moment that his son had poisoned him. One day at school his teacher looked inside his desk and found files on deadly poisons. Being worried what she saw, she raised the alarm about Graham and he was taken to the doctors, and the doctor sent him straight to psychiatrist, who informed the police. Graham was charged with 3 attempts of murder, his father, sister, and friend He wasn't charged with Molly's murder because there wasn't any evidence because her body was cremated. Graham, who was only 14 at the time, was sentenced to 15 years in the worst criminal hospital in England, Broadmoor in Berkshire. Graham was the youngest criminal to be sent there, a place full of murders and the badly insane. Graham didn't care. He was always straightforward and told the other inmates what he was in for. They spoke to Graham, but none of them trusted him around. Lunchtime, Graham was allowed in the library as long as he wanted, so he carried on reading about poisons and Hitler and the Nazis. But no one took any notice of what he read. One of the inmates got on Graham's nerves. Every night his name was Johan Barrage. The man would snore all the time. One day Johan got very sick and died. He'd been poisoned by cyanide. The staff couldn't understand how this could have happened. Young said to the staff that in the grounds there was a laurel bush. It had shiny green leaves. If you crush one, it produces cyanide, but the staff didn't make the connection. In 1970, Unwin wrote to the Home Secretary recommending that Graham should be realized. Not long after Young was realized. On the outside, Young went to live with his sister Winifred and her family Hemel Hampstead. Straight away he looked for a job and found one at Photographic Factory in Slough. At first he had to do 3 months training to pass the exam. He told the boss he was working at a chemist, but he didn't pass his finale exam. They obviously knew nothing of his real past. He would catch a bus to and through to his job in Slough. One day he decided to move out of his sister's and get a bed sit in Slough. Now he thought, I can get on with things. Where he lived there was a young man named Trevor Sparks who would start feeling unwell. He would be violently sick and get tremendous stomach cramps. Graham gave Trevor a glass, saying, "This will make you feel better." After drinking the wine, Trevor got a lot worse. His face and neck started to swell. He had agonizing pains shooting into his backside, and his hair started to fall out. Of course, Graham watched on, documenting all the symptoms. At the factory, Graham was a loner, except at break time when the tea was brought round. Graham would hand the tea to the workers. It wasn't long before the workers started getting sick. They named it the Bomington bug. In 1971, Bob Eagle, the manager, was struck down. He was in and out of hospital all the time, and Graham would go and visit him. Unfortunately, Bob died after a lot of pain. Because Graham was or looked close to Bob, he was asked to represent the firm at the funeral. Brendan Hayward, a detective, was asked to go and talk to the workers and find out what was going on. Next Graham had it in for was Fred Biggs. He died in hospital after being given 100 grams of thallium. Fred and Bob was very close to Graham, so no one suspected him. The police was putting every thing into sorting out what was going on in the factory. The company doctor came to speak to the workers about the illness striking nearly everyone down. Graham stood up and said, "Don't you think this is more serious than you're making out?" This made the doctor very suspicious, so he had a word with the police. A constable, Mick Crimstead, was sent to search Young's bed. Said he found a vial of thallium, some very dark pictures that Young drew, and a notebook which some of it read, "I went to see Bob and took him a small bottle of brandy to make sure he doesn't wake up." Graham was arrested, and when in court he denied everything. Graham was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and 2 attempted counts of murder. For reasons unknown, Graham asked if he could go to another prison. He didn't want to go back to Broadmoor, so he got life inside Parkhurst, Isle of Wight, England. Although in Parkhurst there was a lot of murders and plain evil prisoners, Graham was the most feared. Graham Young died on the 1st of August 1990 of heart failure. He's buried at Parkhurst.